Have you heard of the prophet Elijah? He is one of the most enigmatic and powerful characters in the Bible. Today, I'm going to reveal a secret about Elijah that every believer needs to know. Stay with me until the end of this video, because what you're about to discover could transform your spiritual life. At first glance, Elijah was a common man, like any other of his time. He lived in a small village in the hills of Gilead, a simple place surrounded by pastures and small crops. The days passed quietly, marked by agricultural activities and the rhythm of the seasons. But Elijah, although he led an apparently normal life, felt something different inside him, something that set him apart from other men. From a young age, he had a special sensitivity to spiritual matters. There was a fire in his heart that never went out, a restlessness that he couldn't ignore. The land where Elijah lived was overwhelmed with idolatry. The people of Israel, once dedicated to the God of their ancestors, had turned away, following false gods, especially Baal, under the corrupt influence of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. Idolatry was spreading like a plague, corrupting the faith and customs of the people. The worship of Baal involved detestable practices, and the morality of Israel was in decline. Elijah, observing this spiritual decay, felt a deep pain in his spirit. He knew that the true God, the Lord of Israel, was being ignored and disrespected. His heart burned with the need to do something about it. It was during the long nights, under the starry sky of Gilead, that Elijah heard the voice of God. It wasn't an audible voice, but a deep conviction that grew within him, a certainty that enveloped him completely. God was calling him to something great, something he could never have imagined on his own. Elijah knew he couldn't ignore this call. He couldn't continue living as before while God's name was being profaned. Elijah made the most difficult decision of his life. He left behind his home, his family, and everything familiar to him. He didn't know exactly where God would lead him, but he was certain he needed to obey. He began to move toward the destiny God was mapping out for him, with unshakable faith and courage that came from above. This decision set him apart from his peers and placed him on a lonely path, but one filled with purpose. Over time, Elijah emerged as a prophet, a spokesperson for God. His words were sharp as a sword, cutting through the indifference and idolatry that dominated Israel. He confronted kings and challenged priests, always with the authority that came from the Lord. Elijah was not afraid, for he knew that God was with him. His name began to be known throughout the kingdom, and people spoke of him with respect and fear. But it wasn't Elijah's power that made him feared. It was the power of God acting through him. Elijah was merely an instrument in the hands of the Almighty. He had given up everything to follow God's call, and in return, God used him to accomplish extraordinary feats, miracles that defied the laws of nature and demonstrated that the Lord of Israel was the only true God. Elijah, that common man from Gilead, had become the most feared and respected prophet of his time, not because of his own strength, but because he had completely surrendered to the divine call. Elijah's journey teaches us that God can call anyone, regardless of their background or circumstances. All that is required is a heart willing to obey and follow the path he lays out, even if it means leaving everything behind. Elijah shows us that with God, the ordinary can become extraordinary, and the impossible a reality. His first great challenge was confronting King Ahab, a wicked man who promoted the worship of the false god Baal. Elijah, courageous, declared that a devastating drought would come upon the land and would only end when he prayed for rain to fall again. And so it was. The land became dry, suffering spread, but Elijah remained steadfast, trusting in God's power. Elijah was a simple man, but deeply committed to God, and this made him feared by those who opposed the truth. During his time, Israel was steeped in idolatry, led by one of the most wicked kings in biblical history, Ahab. Influenced by his wife Jezebel, Ahab had abandoned the worship of the God of Israel and erected altars to Baal, a false god who promised prosperity, but, in reality, led the people to spiritual destruction. The scene was one of spiritual chaos. The people, once devoted to God, now bowed before idols, forgetting God's promises and commandments. Elijah, moved by a burning zeal for God's holiness, knew that something had to be done to confront this situation. And so it was that, with the authority given to him by God, he presented himself before Ahab, a king accustomed to flattery, but who now faced the unwavering gaze of a prophet sent by God. Elijah, without fear of possible repercussions, declared with a firm and unshakable voice, "As surely as the Lord, God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there will be neither dew nor rain in these years, except by my word." This declaration was more than just a prophecy. It was a direct blow to the king's confidence in Baal. For Baal was considered the god of fertility and rain. If there were no rain, it would be evident that Baal had no power and that the true God of Israel was in control. The drought announced by Elijah was relentless. For 3.5 years, not a drop of rain fell from the sky. The ground cracked, rivers dried up, crops failed, and famine ravaged the people. The suffering was palpable, but the purpose behind this calamity was greater than anyone could understand at the time. God was using Elijah to show Israel that there was no other God besides him, that the true source of life and provision was not a lifeless idol, but the living God of their ancestors. During this period of drought, Ahab and Jezebel, instead of repenting, intensified their search for Elijah, wanting to kill him. They believed that by eliminating the prophet, they could reverse the situation. But Elijah, sustained by God, remained hidden, first by the brook of Cherith, where he was fed by ravens, and then in the widow of Zarephath's house, where more miracles occurred, reaffirming God's power in his life. Even in the face of misery and despair, Elijah did not waver. He knew that in due time, God would call him to act again. And so it was. After 3.5 years, Elijah reappeared, not as a defeated or fearful man, but with the same courage and determination that had characterized him from the beginning. He presented himself again before Ahab, now for the final confrontation, which would culminate in the challenge on Mount Carmel, where God's power would be displayed undeniably. This first confrontation between Elijah and Ahab was not just a struggle between two men, but a spiritual battle between God's truth and the lies of idols. Elijah, with his unwavering faith and total obedience to God, became an instrument in the hands of the Lord to bring Israel back to the path of truth. He showed that, even when the situation seems impossible, when the entire nation goes astray, God can still use a single faithful man to transform the course of history. During the terrible drought that devastated Israel, God guided Elijah to an unlikely place, the city of Zarephath, located in Sidon, outside the borders of Israel. This choice in itself was significant. Zarephath was a pagan city, situated in the territory from which Jezebel, the queen who so fervently promoted the worship of Baal, came. Even in a foreign land, the God of Israel would demonstrate his power and provision. Obeying God's voice, Elijah arrived at the city gates and found a widow gathering sticks. The woman's situation was desperate. With only a handful of flour and a little oil, she was preparing to make her last meal, along with her son, before succumbing to hunger. The drought that had ravaged Israel also affected Zarephath, and resources were exhausted. When Elijah saw her, he asked her to bring him a little water, which was already a challenge in times of scarcity. But then, he made an even more surprising request, that she bake a small cake for him first, before preparing something for herself and her son. To many, this might seem like an insensitive request, but Elijah was acting in total obedience to God, carrying a promise that would change the woman's life forever. Elijah said, "Do not be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first make a small cake of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. And then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord gives rain on the land." This was a test of faith, not only for the widow, but also for Elijah. They had to trust that God, in his faithfulness, would fulfill his word. The woman, moved by an unexpected faith, obeyed the prophet. And then the miracle happened. Day after day, the flour in the jar and the oil in the jug did not run out. The divine provision was continuous, sustaining not only the widow and her son, but also Elijah himself. With each meal, that miracle renewed their faith, showing that God not only sees the needs of his people, but acts abundantly to supply them. However, the story does not end there. Sometime later, tragedy struck the widow's home. Her son fell seriously ill and died. The woman, in her pain and despair, questioned Elijah, perhaps thinking that the prophet's presence had brought calamity. But Elijah, deeply moved, took the boy and carried him to the upper room where he was staying. There, he laid the boy on his own bed and cried out to God with all his heart, saying, "O Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." Elijah prayed fervently, and God heard his cry. The boy's life returned to his body, and he was revived. Elijah came down with the boy in his arms and handed him to his mother, who was now incredulous and amazed. She exclaimed, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." This episode in Zarephath reveals several profound lessons. First, we see that God cares for everyone, regardless of their origin or social status. He chose a pagan widow in a foreign land to be an instrument of his miracle. Second, we are reminded that true faith often requires sacrifice and trust in seemingly impossible situations. The widow gave the little she had, but in return, she received enough to survive the entire drought and also witnessed the power of God resurrecting her son. Finally, this story demonstrates that God's presence, even in times of scarcity and pain, is sufficient to bring life and hope where all seemed lost. Elijah, obedient and full of faith, was the channel through which God showed his faithfulness and power. And the widow of Zarephath, by opening her door and her heart to God's prophet, not only saved her life and that of her son, but also had a transformative encounter with the living God. But the most dramatic moment in Elijah's life was the challenge on Mount Carmel. He faced hundreds of prophets of Baal in a contest to prove who was the true God. The prophets of Baal prayed and shouted, but nothing happened. Then Elijah prayed, and God sent fire from heaven, consuming the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and even the water around it. The people of Israel fell to their knees, acknowledging that the Lord was the only true God. This is a story of unshakable faith, spiritual confrontation, and the powerful revelation of the God of Israel. The scene unfolds at a time of great apostasy in Israel, where most of the people had abandoned the worship of the true God, drawn to pagan gods, particularly Baal, promoted by the wicked influence of Queen Jezebel. Elijah, full of zeal for God, could no longer bear to see God's people divided and deceived. He directly challenged King Ahab and the prophets of Baal, proposing a public test, an open confrontation, so that the people of Israel could see who the true God was. The chosen site was Mount Carmel, a place significant both to the worship of Baal and to the God of Israel. The challenge was simple but audacious. Elijah and the 450 prophets of Baal would prepare 2 sacrifices, each placing a bull on the wood on their respective altars. However, no fire would be lit by human hands. Instead, Elijah declared that the true God would respond by sending fire from heaven to consume the sacrifice. The God who answered by fire would be the true God, and everyone should follow him. The scene is electrifying. The prophets of Baal began their invocations early in the morning. They danced around the altar, shouted, and cut themselves with knives and spears in a frantic attempt to get their God's attention. But despite all their desperate efforts, nothing happened. The sky remained silent, and no flame descended. Elijah, with a mixture of courage and irony, mocked them, suggesting that perhaps Baal was sleeping or on a journey and couldn't hear them. As the day wore on and the prophets of Baal exhausted themselves in their attempts, Elijah finally took center stage. He called the people to come closer and began to repair the altar of the Lord that had been broken down. With 12 stones, he rebuilt the altar, symbolizing the 12 tribes of Israel, reminding the people of their true identity and spiritual heritage. Then, Elijah did something even more astounding. He ordered that 4 large jars of water be poured over the sacrifice and the wood. He did this 3 times until the water completely soaked the altar and filled the trench around it. What Elijah was about to do would not only be difficult, but humanly impossible. Elijah then prayed. His prayer was simple but full of faith. "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." The heavens responded in spectacular fashion. Fire fell with power upon the altar, consuming the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and even the water in the trench. The people, who had watched in silence, could no longer deny the reality before their eyes. They all fell to their knees, proclaiming, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" The confrontation was resolved, and the supremacy of the God of Israel was established beyond dispute. After this demonstration of God's power, Elijah ordered the prophets of Baal to be captured and executed, thus eliminating the corrupt leadership that had led Israel into idolatry. The event on Mount Carmel was a turning point in Israel's spiritual history, temporarily restoring the people to true worship, though the spiritual battles would continue. The challenge on Mount Carmel was not just a victory over false gods. It was a powerful manifestation that God is present and active in the history of His people. It showed that when true faith and obedience are demonstrated, God responds in a way that all can see and know His glory. Elijah, in his boldness and faith, became the channel through which God revealed His power, proving once and for all that there is no other God besides the Lord, the God of Israel. After the spectacular confrontation on Mount Carmel, where God powerfully manifested Himself by sending fire from heaven, Elijah's victory seemed complete. The people of Israel, now convinced that the Lord is the true God, fell to their knees and declared, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" The false worship of Baal was publicly exposed, and the prophets of Baal were captured and executed, temporarily purifying Israel from the corrupting influence of idolatry. However, Elijah's work was far from finished. The drought that had plagued the land for 3.5 years still persisted. Elijah knew that the time for rain was near, but as a man of faith and prayer, he did not assume that the rain would come automatically after the confrontation. He climbed to the top of Mount Carmel to pray, once again demonstrating his complete dependence on God. Elijah bowed to the ground, placing his face between his knees in a posture of intense supplication and humility. He prayed fervently, asking God to send the promised rain. After each prayer, he sent his servant to look toward the sea for any sign of rain. 6 times the servant returned with the same answer, "There is nothing." But Elijah, with unshakable faith, continued praying, confident that God would respond. On the 7th time, the servant finally saw something. A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea. To many, a small cloud might seem insignificant, but to Elijah, it was the sign he had been waiting for. He immediately instructed his servant to warn King Ahab to prepare, because a great rain was coming. As Ahab departed in his chariot, the small cloud quickly grew, darkening the sky and bringing a torrential downpour. The drought finally ended, and the parched land was quenched by the water that had long been withheld. This rain was not only a physical relief, but a spiritual sign that God had restored His blessing upon Israel. However, this spiritual victory for Elijah did not come without consequences. Jezebel, the cruel queen devoted to Baal, upon learning of the fate of the prophets she had supported, became furious. In her wrath, she sent a message to Elijah, swearing vengeance. "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." Despite having faced kings and false prophets with courage, this personal and direct threat deeply shook Elijah. He knew the power and cruelty of Jezebel, And for a moment, the great prophet of God, who had witnessed so many manifestations of divine power, felt the weight of fear and exhaustion. Elijah fled for his life, going to Beersheba, a town in southern Judah, and leaving his servant behind, he ventured into the desert, wishing to die. Under a broom tree, exhausted and discouraged, Elijah prayed for death. "I have had enough, Lord. Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors." He felt alone, defeated, as if all his efforts had been in vain. However, God was not finished with Elijah. As he slept, an angel of the Lord came and touched him, offering him bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. Elijah ate and drank and lay down again. Once more, the angel touched him, instructing him to get up and eat, for a long journey lay ahead. With the strength from that food, Elijah traveled 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Horeb, the same mountain where Moses had encountered God. There, in a cave, Elijah found refuge and a new divine revelation. The God who had shown his power through fire on Mount Carmel would now reveal himself to Elijah in a different way, not in the strong wind, nor the earthquake, nor the fire, but in a gentle and quiet whisper. In that intimate encounter, God restored Elijah's soul, reminding him that he was not alone. There were still 7,000 in Israel who had not bowed to Baal, and God had more work for Elijah to do. Reinvigorated, Elijah returned to his mission, knowing that God was with him, not only in moments of public triumph, but also in the depths of his personal struggles. The end of the drought and the subsequent persecution by Jezebel marked a crucial point in Elijah's journey. Even a prophet as powerful and faithful as Elijah was not immune to discouragement and exhaustion. But through these trials, God demonstrated his continued presence and care, showing that even in moments of greatest weakness, he is the strength and source of renewal for those who serve him. After the intense confrontation on Mount Carmel, the end of the drought, and the relentless persecution by Jezebel, Elijah, the prophet of God, found himself at one of the lowest points in his life. Despite experiencing tremendous victories and witnessing God's power manifest in spectacular ways, the weight of opposition, fear, and physical and emotional exhaustion pushed him to the brink. Feeling defeated and alone, Elijah fled into the wilderness, seeking refuge and, perhaps, an end to his suffering. On his solitary journey, Elijah reached Mount Horeb, also known as Mount Sinai, a place rich in spiritual significance. It was there that Moses, centuries earlier, had encountered God and received the 10 Commandments. Now, Elijah was about to have his own transformative experience with the Creator. Elijah arrived at Horeb deeply exhausted, both physically and spiritually. He took shelter in a cave, a symbol of his desire to escape, to hide, to find some peace amid the turmoil of his prophetic mission. But God, who never abandons his servants, came to meet Elijah in the midst of his anguish. And the Lord asked him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" This question was both a call to reflection and an invitation for Elijah to express the depth of his pain. Elijah responded with sincerity, pouring out his heart, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." These words revealed Elijah's despair. He felt isolated, as if all his efforts had been in vain, and as if he were the last faithful remnant to God in the entire nation. God then called Elijah to come out of the cave and stand in the presence of the Lord, for he was about to pass by. What followed was a series of powerful natural manifestations, each more impressive than the last. First, a strong wind that tore through the mountains and shattered the rocks into pieces. Then, an earthquake that shook the ground violently. Next, a fire that burned intensely. Each of these manifestations was awe-inspiring and undoubtedly reminded Elijah of God's sovereign power. But in each of these manifestations, the Bible says, the Lord was not in them. These mighty demonstrations of nature, though impressive, did not carry the personal presence of God that Elijah so desperately needed at that moment. Then, after the fire, came a gentle whisper, a still, small voice, almost imperceptible, yet laden with a profound and personal divine presence. When Elijah heard this whisper, he recognized the presence of the Lord. He stepped out of the cave and covered his face with his cloak, a sign of reverence and humility before God's holiness. In this moment of quiet intimacy, God spoke to Elijah again, repeating the question, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" But this time, the question was not just a call for reflection, but a call to renew his mission. God then revealed to Elijah that, despite his feelings of loneliness, he was not truly alone. There were still 7,000 in Israel who had not bowed to Baal, 7,000 who remained faithful. Additionally, God gave Elijah new instructions, sending him back to the spiritual battlefield with a renewed mission. He was to anoint Hazael as king over Aram, Jehu as king over Israel, and Elisha as his own successor in the prophetic ministry. This encounter on Mount Horeb was crucial for Elijah. It was not just a mystical experience, but a turning point that restored his strength and vision. God showed Elijah that his power is not only manifested in grand and spectacular events, but also in the gentleness of his constant and faithful presence, even in the most difficult moments. Elijah descended from Mount Horeb not just as a reinvigorated prophet, but as a man renewed in his mission and in his understanding of God's character. He realized that while dramatic events like the fire on Mount Carmel have their place, God's presence is most often found in the stillness and intimacy of faith. This encounter on Horeb, with its gentle and quiet whisper, was God's way of reminding Elijah, and all of us, that he is always present, even when we cannot see him or feel his power in an obvious way. From that point on, Elijah's journey would continue, now with the assurance that in every moment of loneliness or doubt, God was near, guiding him and sustaining him with a presence that is both powerful and gentle. After the transformative encounter with God on Mount Horeb, Elijah returned to his mission with a renewed heart and clarity about the next step God wanted him to take. Among the instructions he received, one stood out for its significance to the future of the prophetic ministry in Israel. Elijah was to anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, as his successor. Elisha was a young farmer, working on his family's land when Elijah found him. The scene where Elijah met Elisha is simple, but profoundly significant. Elisha was plowing with 12 yokes of oxen, which suggests that his family was relatively prosperous. He was driving the 12th pair, indicating that he was not merely a supervisor, but someone who actively participated in the work. When Elijah approached Elisha, he did not say a word. Instead, in a gesture full of symbolism, Elijah threw his cloak over Elisha. This cloak, known as the Adeth, was more than just a piece of clothing. It represented Elijah's authority and prophetic calling. By placing the cloak on Elisha, Elijah was signaling that God's call was now upon him, that he would be the next great prophet of Israel. Elisha immediately understood the meaning of the gesture. He did not ask for explanations or question Elijah's choice. Instead, he made a quick and decisive decision. He asked for permission to say goodbye to his parents, a gesture that showed his respect and love for his family, but also his understanding that a new phase of his life was about to begin. Elijah, recognizing the importance of this moment, allowed him to do so. What Elisha did next demonstrated his total commitment to God's call. He slaughtered the oxen with which he had been plowing and used the plowing equipment as firewood to make a sacrifice. This act was a powerful symbol of breaking with his old way of life. By sacrificing the oxen and burning the plow, Elisha was committing himself completely to his new calling. There would be no return to the old life. He was dedicating himself entirely to the service of God. After bidding farewell to his family and sharing the meal from the sacrifice with the people, Elisha followed Elijah. He became his assistant, learning from the older prophet and closely observing how Elijah served God. This period of discipleship was essential for Elisha, as he not only gained knowledge, but was also shaped by Elijah's example of faith, courage, and obedience. Elisha's calling is an impressive example of readiness and willingness to follow God's call, even when it meant leaving behind a comfortable and secure life. Elisha did not hesitate, did not look back, and did not try to keep a backup plan. He burned what tied him to the past, signaling that his loyalty was now fully with God and the mission he had for his life. This willingness of Elisha to follow God wholeheartedly prepared the way for what was to come. During the years he served alongside Elijah, Elisha grew in wisdom and spiritual power. He witnessed Elijah perform great deeds, and his desire to serve God was fueled by his close proximity to the prophet. When Elijah's time on earth came to an end, Elisha was prepared, both in spirit and character, to take up the mantle of the prophetic ministry. Elisha's call teaches us about the importance of being ready to hear and obey God's voice. Sometimes, God calls us to leave behind what we know so that we can enter something new and greater in His plan. Elisha was willing to pay the price, and because of that, he was used powerfully by God in his generation. He became one of Israel's greatest prophets, performing even more impressive miracles than those done by Elijah, showing that the Spirit of God that was upon Elijah had truly been transferred to him. The simple gesture of Elijah, throwing his cloak over Elisha, triggered a series of events that would change the course of Israel's history. And just like Elisha, we are invited to respond to God's call in our lives with the same readiness and dedication, trusting that He will guide and use us to fulfill His eternal purpose. Elijah's journey as God's prophet was coming to an end, but his story would not conclude in an ordinary manner. Elijah, knowing that his time on earth was nearing its close, began his final journey with Elisha, his faithful disciple and designated successor. The narrative of Elijah's ascension to heaven is one of the most extraordinary and symbolic in the Bible, filled with power, mystery, and the culmination of a life dedicated to God's service. As Elijah and Elisha walked together, the deep connection between master and disciple was evident. Elijah, who had faced kings, defeated false prophets, and called down fire from heaven, was now preparing to pass on the mantle of prophetic leadership to Elisha. But before doing so, he wanted to test Elisha's determination, offering him the opportunity to stay behind. 3 times, Elijah told Elisha to remain where he was while he went on ahead, but 3 times Elisha refused, insisting, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." Elisha's insistence on staying with Elijah until the end revealed his deep commitment and desire to receive the double portion of the Spirit that was upon his master. Elijah, recognizing Elisha's sincerity and fervor, accepted his company, and together they continued their journey. The journey took them through several significant cities, Gilgal, Bethel, and Jericho, each representing an important point in Israel's history and symbolically in the spiritual life of a believer. Finally, they arrived at the banks of the Jordan River. There, Elijah performed one last miracle before his departure. He rolled up his cloak and struck the waters of the Jordan, which parted, allowing the two to cross on dry ground, just as Moses had done centuries before. This final act of power demonstrated that God was still with Elijah, confirming his authority until the very last moment. After crossing the Jordan, Elijah asked Elisha, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" Without hesitation, Elisha asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. This request was not for power or glory, but for a spiritual empowerment that would enable him to continue the prophetic ministry with the same effectiveness and fervor that had marked Elijah's life. Elijah responded that Elisha had asked for a difficult thing, but that if he saw Elijah being taken from him, then his request would be granted. This created a moment of expectation and tension, as Elisha's destiny was about to be decided. Suddenly, as they were walking and talking, something spectacular happened. A chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared, separating the two of them. Elijah was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind. The vision was so impressive that Elisha cried out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." This exclamation symbolized Elisha's recognition that Elijah, in his life and ministry, was a powerful force in Israel, greater even than armies and chariots of war. Elijah disappeared from Elisha's sight, taken to heaven in a way no other human had ever experienced before. He did not die like other men. Instead, he was translated directly into God's presence, a testament to his holy and dedicated life. Seeing Elijah depart, Elisha tore his clothes in a gesture of mourning and reverence, but at the same time, he picked up Elijah's cloak that had fallen during the ascension. This cloak, now in his hands, symbolized that Elijah's spirit had been transferred to him. With the cloak, Elisha returned to the Jordan and, with faith, struck the waters, saying, "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" And the waters parted again, confirming that the same God who had worked through Elijah was now with Elisha. Elijah's ascension to heaven was not just a spectacular event, but also a powerful transition of spiritual leadership in Israel. The cloak that fell from Elijah became a symbol of the continuity of God's work, passing from one generation to the next. Elisha, now clothed with Elijah's spiritual authority, would continue the work of prophesying in God's name, performing even greater miracles and leading the people of Israel back to true worship. This unique event in biblical history not only marked the end of Elijah's earthly career, but also signaled the beginning of a new era of ministry under Elisha's leadership. The way Elijah was taken to heaven serves as a testimony to God's faithfulness to his servants and the reward that awaits those who remain steadfast in his service. For the people of Israel, the memory of Elijah would continue to inspire faith and reverence, and his ascension to heaven would become a symbol of hope and redemption, pointing to God's power to raise up leaders and transform lives. But what exactly made Elijah such a powerful and influential prophet? What was behind his miracles and his spiritual authority? The answer to these questions lies in something deeper than the visible acts of Elijah. The true secret of Elijah, which every believer should know, was not just in his ability to perform supernatural feats, but in his intimate and obedient relationship with God. The secret of Elijah was his total dependence on God. From the beginning of his ministry, Elijah demonstrated unshakable faith and radical obedience. When God called him to confront King Ahab, Elijah did not hesitate, even though he knew the dangers he would face in challenging the king and Queen Jezebel. He fully trusted that God was in control and that his words were not his own, but the Lord's. This trust in God was the foundation of his entire life and ministry. Elijah did not seek his own glory or power. He was a man who lived to do God's will. His life was a continuous response to the divine call, whether he was sent to confront kings or to hide by a brook where ravens would feed him. Elijah knew that every command from God had a purpose, even when he couldn't see the full picture. In addition to his obedience, Elijah was a man of fervent prayer. On several occasions, we see Elijah withdrawing to pray, seeking God's guidance and power. When Elijah prayed, he did so with the certainty that God would hear and answer. This was evident on Mount Carmel, when, after confronting the prophets of Baal, he prayed for God to send fire from heaven. His prayer was neither long nor complicated, but it was effective because it was the result of a life lived in intimacy with God. The secret of Elijah also lay in his humility. Even after performing spectacular miracles, Elijah never exalted himself. He knew he was merely an instrument in God's hands. This became clear when, tired and discouraged, he fled to the wilderness after being threatened by Jezebel. There, in his weakness, Elijah did not hide his despair from God. Instead of presenting himself as an invincible hero, he opened up to God, showing that even great men of faith can have moments of doubt and weakness. And it was in this vulnerability that God met him, restoring his strength and renewing his mission. The secret of Elijah is a powerful reminder for all of us that true power does not come from ourselves, but from our connection with God. Elijah was an ordinary man, subject to the same weaknesses and challenges that we all face. What set him apart was his willingness to surrender completely to God's will, trust in his providence, and continually seek his presence. This secret, then, is accessible to all of us. We don't need to be famous prophets or perform miracles to live in the fullness of God's power. What we need is to cultivate an intimate relationship with God based on obedience, prayer, and humility. If we do this, like Elijah, we will see God work powerfully in our lives, and we will become living witnesses of his power and glory. Elijah did not leave a legacy of wealth or grand buildings, but something far more enduring, an example of a life fully surrendered to God. This is the secret that every believer should know and follow. If we live like Elijah, trusting and obeying God in all things, we too will experience the depth of God's power and presence in our lives. Elijah's story is not just an ancient tale. It is a living example of how we should live our faith today. No matter the size of the challenges we face, if we remain steadfast in our faith and obedient to God's voice, we will see his power at work in our lives. So, why not follow Elijah's example? Trust fully in God, obey his will, and get ready to see miracles in your life. If you were touched by this story and want to learn more about how to apply these principles in your life, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next videos. Share this message with your friends and family, and together, let's continue spreading the transforming power of God's Word. Thank you for watching. May God bless your life, and see you in the next video.